is Becca, and I am a photographer, I'm a writer, and I'm a farmer based out of Bozeman. I'm really excited to be here talking to you all tonight about how photography has allowed me to connect the world around me. I've broken this talk up into 3 different categories: connection to place, connection to land, and then finally connection to community. Okay, I have a lot of slides ahead of us tonight, but they're all photos or videos, so it should be really easy viewing. But if you see something that catches your eye, please make a note of it. We can talk about it later because there should be room for questions. Yeah, okay, should be room for questions. Okay. Connection to place. Clicker, working. Oh, so much better. Okay. Connection to place. So I grew up splitting time between Colorado and Wyoming. My parents lived in Denver, but my grandparents ran an outfitting company outside of Pinedale, Wyoming. So we would travel there as much as possible to see the majority of my family, to spend time together, and to help them out. You can see I'm really helping out my grandfather there. Growing up, we spent a lot of time outside. My parents are geologists, so we would go on vacations to the Wyoming desert to look at rocks. And I didn't realize that this was sort of an odd upbringing until I was maybe 11 or 12, and we're back from spring break, sitting at the cafeteria table, and my friends around me have gone to Disneyland, and Florida, and California, and beaches. And I told them that I learned what an agate was. So I knew that we were maybe just a little bit of an unconventional family. But I also knew that because of the artwork we had hanging up in our home. So this photo on the right, the climber, is my uncle Todd Skinner. He was a professional rock climber for the North Face. And then my dad, my grandfather, and all of my grandfather's brothers were mountaineers, receiving sponsorships to climb all over the world. This is actually my dad, Orion Skinner, here, right next to me. He's on Everest in the 80s in this photo. So adventure and exploration just seemed to run in my blood. And though I thought it was extremely uncool to be studying geology during all of my parents' free time, it eventually wore off on me, much to my parents' delight, but in a different way, because I also fell in love with rock climbing. When I got to the point of choosing where I wanted to go to college, I chose the University of Wyoming. And this was the only school I applied for because it was closest to the local rock climbing area called Beautiful. I had seen these photos of climbers in these far-off expeditions around the world growing up, and I wanted to make sure that I was like those individuals that I was seeing on the photos. I was studying social work and grant writing in college, but I wasn't totally sure how that was going to pan out for me down the road. And then there was photography. I had been carrying a camera with me as I went on various climbing trips, and I started to take my friends out for little fun photo shoots like this one out to Wyoming. And anyone who's driven through the state of Montana or Wyoming recognizes when a road looks like this. You know, when you don't have to get somewhere and you're stuck in the car, it's actually kind of beautiful. I loved shooting photos, and it had become this steadfast love of mine as I suffered some pretty major losses in my life through high school and college. It became a way to capture what I was feeling or seeing and hold on to it for just a small moment in time before the moment dissipated. And I also felt like it was a way to exercise my creativity in this just total need to create something. I also realized I could shoot what I saw or felt when I was in a landscape. I was just one tiny human in this big, wide open space, and I was trying to communicate through photos, or at least this one, that I was feeling a little lost in the world, trying to find my purpose. There was so much comfort that I felt, and still to this day I feel, when I walked into a place with so much land and so much sky that it's big enough to hold me and any big emotions that I'm coming in with. Little did I know, these mini photo shoots would come in handy, because one day I was walking to class through the University of Wyoming's halls, and I saw a poster that the university was offering a grant for one student to photograph what was happening in New Orleans 5 years after Hurricane Katrina had decimated the city. Okay, I'm going to be totally honest with you guys. I really needed extra credit. I had started to skip school a little bit for some climbing trips and then these photo shoots, and I thought it could be an interesting way to make up some points, and I proposed it as an independent study, applied for the grant, and surprisingly, within a month, I was on my way to New Orleans. So when I got there, I realized my studies in social work were actually going to come in handy. Tangible evidence of what I had been listening to were actually coming in handy on the ground. I was in a totally new community, a totally new cultural landscape. Everywhere we went, I asked people for their stories. But my best photos came when I was in the practice of deep listening. Listening to people's sorrow, the loss of their family, of their jobs, of the places they grew up. Listening to all of these heartbreaking stories in many ways. Okay. Does this work for everyone? Great. Okay. So, that's okay. We'll roll with it. So, listening to these people's stories was truly heartbreaking, and in so many ways I felt completely helpless. Like when Robert Green here told me that he and his mom and his nephew were in the lower ninth ward. The water was rising, they poked a hole in the roof and climbed up on top of their roof, which then the roof came off the top of their home, floated down the road, hit this tree where his mom and his nephew passed away right in front of them. Totally helpless when you hear a story like that. But then I had my camera. I had this small tool that I could use to help bring his story to us today. That I could help bring some photos back to my community in Wyoming and let them know that New Orleans was still suffering, that the communities there still needed our empathy and our attention and our help. But why did people open up to me? I was a stranger, holding a camera, walking down the sidewalks of their neighborhood. But I'd like to think it's because I didn't rush. I had the time and the interest to listen to their stories, and sometimes people just need to feel heard. Like Miss Helen here, I actually stopped the car as we were driving down the street and said, "Pull over, this woman has the best wrinkles I've ever seen in my entire life, and I have no idea if I can take her photo." She let me. And we talked a little bit about her story when she walked 6 miles to the Superdome to get help when her neighborhood was flooding. And then, after we sat and chatted for a few hours, she invited us in for gumbo. And you bet I took her up on that. So this idea of not being in the practice of taking, of not being in so much of a rush, at least for me as a photographer, to not be in so much of a rush to get the story, to get the image, and then leave. To forget why you're there in the first place. This is really important on this journey of connection. In so many ways, New Orleans was totally different than any place I had ever known before. I didn't know anyone. the climate was pretty much opposite of Wyoming. I had never been in a natural disaster before, but when I got down to this 30,000-foot view of all of these differences, I actually found so much commonality. People who loved and missed their families. People who were grieving losses. The importance of knowing and helping your neighbor. And I started to realize that maybe this new community and I were not so different after all. Based on this work that I had done for the University of Wyoming, I was asked to apply for a grant from National Geographic. It was called the Young Explorers Grant, and this opportunity was meant to be someone's first field experience with the organization. I was truly excited when the project that we proposed, very similar to my work in New Orleans, was accepted. Our team had proposed to show how the physical and cultural geography of Banda Aceh, Sumatra had changed since the 2004 tsunami. This was my first big trip out of the country, and we researched and photographed in Aceh for a month before we returned back with images. In this photo that we took from a helicopter, I'll see if you guys can find it when I point it out here in a minute, demonstrates the biggest takeaway from my time in Aceh: community resilience. This community resilience is so similar to what I experienced in New Orleans for so many ways, because here, 2 miles inland, you can maybe see it in the middle of the photo, a barge had been carried with the water and settled down in the middle of the city. Instead of tearing it down, the community decided to just build right around it. And if you pay a penny, you can climb up on top of it. They were going to incorporate it into how they moved forward, to rebuild but not forget. This project in Banda Aceh was really successful, and I went on to speak with Nat Geo and do a few gallery openings. But I was a little unsure what to do with this forward momentum I was feeling in my life. Like many of us, I'm sure in this room, who have applied for grants, know the process takes a long time. All of this work going towards projects like New Orleans and then Sumatra had actually taken me about 3 years. I wasn't sure how to make a steady income, and also my schooling had really started to take a hit. My parents, in their truly unwavering support, encouraged me to take some time off school. And maybe for them, they actually meant that I take a semester off, to recalibrate, go back to the drawing board, figure out what I wanted to do. But as most 20-year-olds do, I took my own meaning from their advice. So I packed up my car and my dog, and I started to travel around the West, shooting photos of adventures. What started out as a short road trip turned into several thousand miles traveling around the West. And when I found that I wasn't sure where to go or what to do, I kept coming back to places that made me feel small. Here it is, this connection to land. Places that made me feel small. Places that would or could change my perspective and remind me that the world did not revolve around my insecurities. On these road trips, I started to reach out to some outdoor companies and asked if they need photos for catalogs or websites. I started to make a living as a freelance photographer and writer. Ultimately, I was getting paid to be a storyteller, and that was so cool. Whether it was working for companies that focused on leaving legacies, wild adventures, or just protecting places that we explored, I was getting to communicate through my lens. All of a sudden, or what seemed like all of a sudden, I was traveling for 6 to 9 months out of any given year. When I finally decided to call Bozeman my home, I wasn't even totally sure what that word meant to me anymore. It had been 3 years since I left college and left for the road. But I had been living these adventures that I saw on posters on my wall growing up. In this photo in particular, I am in the height of my full expedition bliss. I mean, I'm so happy in this photo. My husband said, I should mention this is a good old-fashioned gear dump when all your gear is out displayed on the floor. I had just gotten back to Bozeman from a month-long expedition in Canada filming for a digital series for National Geographic Wild. And I was chosen for this particular expedition because I had pretty extensive experience in the backcountry. And they said, we heard you're a strong hiker. And being a strong hiker turned out to be about a prerequisite for this expedition, because though the mission was simple, to find and film coastal wolves, it required some pretty intense backpacking. You can see in this 110-liter pack, it's about as tall as I am, and it's full of 70 pounds of camera gear, food, and supplies. We were going to get dropped off by a float plane on this island 75 miles off the coast of British Columbia on a small island called Nootka. For the first few days, we just hiked. We hiked our gear all the way into the place where we thought and hoped that wolves would be crossing a tributary river. On expeditions, oftentimes your camera gear gets a better sleeping spot than you do. Behind me in this photo, there are about 3 more camera bodies. And we would start sleeping with batteries in the bottom of our sleeping bags to keep them warm, because we had no way to extend their life or recharge them. When we finally got to our location, our pinpointed spot, we built a wildlife blind, hiding ourselves and breaking up our cameras and our portraits from the horizon line. So then the goal was to just wait. For 28 days, every morning, I sat in a wildlife blind with my expedition partner, Birdie, from 6 a.m. until the sun went down. We only left the blind to eat for 30 minutes a day, and then back to watch for wolves. Also, no showering. You can't alter your scent. Wolves have a pretty strong nose. I actually have a short video segment for you. It's about 2 minutes long. And it's going to show what life looked like as we were waiting and watching for wolves. But just to give you a heads up, I'm not in the video. I'm actually the one filming all of it. But it still gives a great idea of what life is like.
Definitely going slightly insane. This year is very beautiful, but yes, once again, very, very tedious.
My ultimate goal for this expedition is to spot a coastal wolf, the apex predator in this ecosystem. But so far, I've had no luck finding them. So I'm going to hunker down and wait for them to come to me. I have to build what wildlife photographers call a hide. Basically, the goal of a hide is to break up my outline so that animals that are evolutionarily programmed to fear my shape won't recognize me. But just as importantly, a hide is a place for me to sit all day that shields me from the elements.
Oh, cozy! Well, I guess the wait begins. Day 2 in the hide. So far, no wolf action. Day 4 in the hide. Not a lot going on, to be honest. One exciting thing.
There's actually tons of birds around. Down the beach, there's a spot where I've seen a heron fishing. And it's pretty funny to watch him wrestle his dinner.
Day 5 in the hide.
I was looking around the tree line and I heard something up in the trees, and it was a barred owl. And I know this because his call sounds a bit like, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you?" It's pretty cool, but it's not the howl of a wolf.
There's also some Canada geese, and these geese are on an epic migration down the coast. They make a racket as well. That's nothing like what they sound like.
Beautiful sunny day. How am I feeling? Bored?
You can see lots of waiting. Sort of a fun glimpse into the first week of our stay on Nootka. The most crushing part, just gonna break it to you now, I did not see a wolf for all 28 days that I was there. Shortly after I left this segment, Birdie had another teammate come in and they ended up finding a full pack of wolves. Hurts a little bit, but but the show was a success. In thinking about this expedition, this was the closest I had ever felt to land. I sat and watched the horizon line for maybe about 12 hours a day for an entire month. I was living and breathing close to this complex temperate rainforest that housed an ecosystem of wolves, of black bears, mountain lions, eagles, an amazing bird and sea life. That year that I was on this expedition, I actually slept more nights outside than I did inside, and just learned to embrace discomfort. It's not like I had been avoiding discomfort by any means, but I realized the sooner I embraced it, the more fun I would end up having. Have you ever heard of the term type 1 fun and type 2 fun? Anyone? No. Okay, great. This is a good lesson. Type 1 fun is where you are having fun the whole time. So fun. Whole time. Type 2 fun is when you cuss and you curse and you cry your way through, and then after it's all over, you look back and think, wow, that was so fun. So you can use that for sure. So embracing discomfort and this type 2 fun came in handy when it came to this next expedition. I had about 2 days at home before I headed off to Panama to circumnavigate an island with another member of National Geographic, my friend Claire Fiesler. We got jobs writing essays for National Geographic Adventure, which was an online platform. And we pitched this idea of circumnavigating an island off the coast of Panama called Bastimento. We were in these foldable kayaks. They literally fold together like origami and buckle across the top. And they start as 2x3 foot boxes and then unfurl into kayaks that are about 16 feet tall. We pitched this idea for an Instagram campaign with the kayak company and National Geographic, and we could slip in some education about mangroves and sea life, protecting it all, while completing something that no one else had. But of course, like my Uncle Todd, who I introduced you to in the beginning of the presentation, he used to say, it's never an adventure until something goes wrong. As we built just a seriously robust packing list, we forgot one crucial thing, the GPS. Claire thought I had it, I thought she had it, and we had been in such a rush to make sure that the kayaks actually floated with all of our water, our camera gear, our food. I mean, there wasn't a lot of food on that list, I'll be honest, but, we still needed to make sure that the kayaks floated. We had left it right there sitting on the dock. And you might be thinking, Becca, it's an island. You have the ocean on one side and land on the other. You can't get lost. And I would agree with you, except for there are these amazing, incredible, dense mangrove forests that house the entrances to our camping spots. So, we had to make do. Also, I hadn't trained. I had just literally sat for 30 days in the same spot, and I lost a bunch of muscle mass. At the end of the expedition, we did about 30 miles of truly challenging ocean kayaking, and we published some of our first writing for the organization. This is on National Geographic Adventure. I wrote this piece on the far end for me, And Claire wrote this piece about how going on an expedition, specifically with me, was like speed dating, because you're constantly putting out fires, you have to learn how to work together, and at the end of the day, if you figure it all out, you're successful in the field. So why am I talking so much about expeditions when this is a conference about farming and connection? Well, I thought my life was going to look like this. I was preparing to travel from one country to another, preparing for major multi-month expeditions as a scientific or research photographer, and expeditions also that were just pure adventure. I thought that's what my life was going to look like. And my connection to the world around me was through the lens, at the time, of a temporary visitor to all of these places. I had a hard time imagining what settling down would look like, and I thought that I probably just wouldn't. My goal in life thus far had been to let people make connections to the world around them through my photography or my writing. And maybe one person would be inspired to try kayaking. Maybe not in the ocean or under those circumstances, but, you'd like to think that you're trying to inspire someone to pick up something new or look up what coastal wolves ate. But as life always hands us unexpected paths, mine was no exception to this rule. I was home for a brief amount of time when something really big happened. I fell in love. It wasn't actually the love that scared me, though it did sort of feel like my chest was being cracked wide open and I was super vulnerable. This love required roots. Because as I was gladly tying myself into a life of partnership, I also became tied to what came with it, which was a farm. But it was unlike any farm I had ever seen in my entire life. He called it a permaculture food forest. There were no straight lines or neat rows of plants that I recognized. I swear when I first stepped in there, every single plant looked exactly the same to me. And I didn't grow up close to my food system. Most of what we ate, whether it was at home or this outfitting camp, had the sole goal of getting as much calories inside of you so you could go back outside. Actually, the more calories, the better. My mom had a tiny raised bed that housed one strawberry plant that produced about 5 strawberries every year. And it was all of her effort and concentration to hide it from the cottontails looking for their sweet treat. But as an adult, I had an interest in learning more about growing food. I learned that permaculture is based on growing in a natural system, working with the earth versus against it. Everything we do in the food forest is based on the health of the soil. I learned about cover crops and companion planting. And when we had an issue with slugs, we employed this very cute team of ducks to go on slug patrol, what we call it. All of the ideas I had about being in one place started to dissipate as I fell in love with one big old acre of food forest. The light was always changing, and I even started to keep bees, which was a lifetime goal of mine. I ended up learning all of the names of every single plant inside the garden, and I learned what a good weed was and which weeds were unwanted. But meanwhile, in my photography work, I was still traveling, and there was a lot of buzz in the outdoor industry about protecting public land. In 2017, places like Grand Staircase Escalante, a national monument, were being reduced in size. In Grand Staircase specifically, the protected area was cut by 47%. Everyone was talking about the importance of public land, and I agree with it. Agreed and agreed. I grew up on public land, camping on BLM and in national forests, but I felt like there was a big part of this conversation that was missing, or at least in my circles. At our farm, we actually share a fence with Head Turner's Flying Bee Ranch. 113,613 acres. Let me read that one more time. 113,613 acres of protected space is where our farm backs up to. And when I first moved into our place in Bozeman, I was pretty darn frustrated with my neighbor because I saw that fence line as land that I would never get to recreate on. It felt like big pieces of red tape were strung across the fences. But the more time I spent on our farm, and the more time that development swiftly spread its tendrils out to reach our rural community, the fracturing of the wild and open lands that I appreciated suddenly became very personal to me. I started to appreciate the space that allowed us to have birds and bees and wildlife move from one section to another without having to cross multiple fences. From our garden ecosystem to anywhere in that 113,000 acres. Falling in love with farming made me recognize the importance of private land conservation, especially as a wildlife buffer zone, and especially in conjunction with public land. I was desperate to bring this idea that farmers and ranchers were doing good things for the environment to a wider audience where seemingly in my circles no one was talking about it. So here we are in this final chapter, connection to community. In my desperation, we'll skip a few slides here, but these are all taken on public land. Here we go. The final chapter, connection to community. My first assignment about ranching came in the form of a foggy, muggy day in Missouri. I had signed up for a photo experience called the Missouri Photo Workshop. It was a week-long, in-depth storytelling assignment. Every year, the workshop moved to a different small town in Missouri with the sole mission of telling stories about the community. But these towns were small. It would be, you can imagine, like 40 photojournalists and 15 staff members dropping into the middle of Glendive. A little shocking. At just under 5,000 people, the residents of Mountain Grove, Missouri were a little shocked that we had chosen their town, but they were really welcoming. The workshop hosted a barbecue where the community could meet us to hear what kind of stories we were interested in telling individually. And I wanted to tell a farming story. And that's where I met Kim and Ernie. We had 2 days to find and pitch a story to our photo editors in the group. And the photo editors were from the Denver Post, the New York Times, National Geographic. Yeah, no pressure there, right? Just have to come up with an amazing photo-worthy story in 2 days, and we could only shoot 300 photos or less for the whole project, which is a big deal for any of us having access to digital cameras and our iPhone. Sky's the limit with the amount of storage we have. So 300 photos is not a lot. But the aim of this was to anticipate the moment, to do more listening than shooting. And I thought, I could do that. But when other people in my group started to bring back stories, I started to get pretty worried. One guy brought back a story about a family who had just lost the patriarch of their family, who was a veteran. The funeral was that week, and he had taken these incredibly touching photos of the granddaughter sobbing over the coffin of her grandfather. And there were stories like this all over the workshop. Intimate, heartbreaking, that we were being invited into. And I started to feel like my story about farming maybe didn't hold the same gravity as the other stories around me to be impactful. So I started to try and bolster my pitch a little bit, and my photo editor saw right through me immediately. She asked me, Are you actually telling their story, or the one that you've created for them? Yeah. And I realized that the truth of this story that I was telling had plenty enough of heart and enough passion that it didn't need any more gravity. It was about working hard to make their dream happen. Both Ernie and Kim work full-time on the ranch. And I'm going to use the words ranch and farm interchangeably here because they did in reference to theirs, and I know that sometimes here we differ, or in other places we differ them. But they both work hard. And they both have off-farm jobs to keep their dream of having their own farm alive. Ernie works at a nearby ranch. And Kim, 3 times a week, drives 2.5 hours one way to work as a veterinarian. They see each other every morning and every evening for 4:30 a.m. coffee. Ernie reads the news, Kim does her Bible study. And I went with Ernie on his 1 day a week to work at this nearby ranch. And as we drove, he told me, I don't want you to get the wrong idea of thinking that this is what ranching is, where we're going. They do a lot of things differently that I don't do at my own place. And I understood. Because he had a dream. My favorite farm, he kept saying. He would do anything it took to keep that dream alive. So, that is the story that I told. We gathered cows to bring them in to get vaccinations, and it started as a pretty cold morning. But as the guys worked in the barn, it started to quickly heat up, get pretty muggy, and turned into a humid, loud, and continuous process until all the cows had gone through the chute. I love this photo because it was such a fleeting moment in time. The photo standing on its own feels pretty impactful to me. We can see that Ernie is tired. We can see that he's hot. He's probably been working a long time. But the one that comes after it, cool. There's still a big line. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. After our day on the ranch, this other place, we came back to his home, to his farm, his favorite farm, where he knew every cow by the number on their tag. It was calving season, and as my first introduction to ranching, I could not believe how much time in the day revolved around counting cows. It's like unbelievable to me. But then Ernie said, I'm going to tell you something, Becca. I'm not really sure what's going to happen to our favorite farm when we get too old to run it. Their kids were away at college, and neither one wanted to come back to run the place. This story with Ernie and Kim totally changed my life. I met them on a Sunday, and on Tuesday, they invited me to live with them for the entire week to shoot their story. They trusted me enough to open their doors, to share their concerns, their fears, and their successes. And it is not normal to be followed around by a photographer all the time. I learned that good photojournalism meant to be a fly on the wall, to share as minimally as possible about myself and allow someone else's story to be more important than what I had to share. And inspired by this work, I came back to Montana to pursue more stories about agriculture. Shortly thereafter, I worked on a story for an organization about a family living in the sandhills of Nebraska. The point of the article was to share glimpses into rural life, but also that ranching could be sustainable. That when we talked about rotational grazing, we're directly talking about birds like this. This horned lark chick Needed to be able to have short grass to navigate around before it could fly. And this curlew also prefers variable grass length. This is another shot of that curlew because I've had a handful of people say, wow, you loved Nebraska? I'm like, yeah, you have no idea what you're missing. People that love rural places. Or this killdeer, who pretends to have a broken wing when you're a little too close to the nest. You probably recognize the sound. They try and lure you away from the nest. And sure enough, I knew that I must be near it as it's pretending to have this broken wing, and the eggs, truly amazingly, blended right into a gravel road, pretty close to the gravel road at least. We spent the week in the sandhills, focusing on birds, bugs, plants, farming, family, and how they all relate to how ranching and farming can go hand in hand with biodiversity. Like this little Woodhouse's toad, who was using a hole made by a prairie dog to camouflage in with her surroundings and to stay cool. In winter or in drought, these toads will dig themselves into little burrows. I also read, in preparing this talk, that since amphibians don't drink water from their mouth, they absorb it through their pelvic floor. So now we know. When I say there's a connection to community for me now, I think of people like all of you, farmers and ranchers, those who wake up at 4:30 in the morning before heading out to off-ranch jobs, or those who work all day in the field, or those of you who get up in the middle of the night to help with lambing, calving, or caring for your animals that continue to feed our world. When people talk about an urban and rural divide, all I think about now is the conversation in the middle that is missing. Did someone like me, who used to see private land as having red tape all over it, could take the time, have the interest, or the curiosity to begin what another perspective even looked like? For me, at this point in my life, I have realized that connection to land, or at least mine, cannot be unnoticed. Whether it was growing up with geologists as parents, or traveling to the opposite side of the planet, I found that connection to me means resilience, community, and healing. I have one last story for you all tonight. A few years ago, I was rushing to get some seeds and bulbs in the ground before the snow came and the ground would freeze. I had had a pretty busy schedule and was just rushing through the act of planting just to get it done. And then I thought about the fact that we are all just temporary hosts to soil and life. I refocused my energy, and when I started to continue planting again, I realized that all of my anxiety and panic to just get the task done was directly transferring into the bulbs and to the food that I was going to harvest or eat or share with friends later on in the year. I want my food to be good, so I've slowed down. The energy that we bring into conversation, to land, and to each other makes a big difference in our impact of our desire to connect. Thank you for taking the time to be here this weekend to learn from each other. If you take one thing away from this talk tonight, I hope you remember this. Through the practice of deep listening, we can realize that there is far more commonality than there is difference. And in that, we will become a stronger community of women and men in agriculture. Thank you.